Hey guys, welcome back. Module 8A. Chapter, what do we get into? Chapter 11. So we're getting well into the course now, which is kind of cool. This is also the week of our second peer scholar activity. So make sure you check Quarkus, get the details on that. I'll post a video that kind of walks you through what I'm thinking in that activity. So watch that, get a good sense of that, and we'll have a little bit of fun on the peer scholar side. Meanwhile, here we're going to go back into the lectures and specifically, let's go to this. This one's entitled Hilgard, Guthrie, Hull, and Tolman. Every now and then I just use the names of the people we're going to be talking about. But really, this is the title of this chapter is Learning Theories. And it's kind of a transitional chapter. It's this interesting time in psychology where behaviorism did its thing, and during the reign of behaviorism there was this whole idea of, let's not talk about what's happening in the animal's mind, let's just talk about the things we can manipulate, stimulate, and the things we can measure objectively, the behavior. And this is a transition where people started to get dissatisfied with that, where they started to say, okay, yeah, you've done a bunch of experiments and you've shown a bunch of cool links between stimuli and responses, but now we actually want to understand what's going on, right? We want the theory that underlies that learning that we're seeing. So you're showing us clear evidence of learning. What is it actually reflecting? So it's almost a bit of a transition back into the mind. After behaviorism kind of kicked everybody out of the mind, now we have people kind of sneaking back in and saying, okay, we're going to try to think about what the animal is thinking about. We're going to consider the internal contents of the mind again. This will eventually lead us to cognitive psychology, where we really cognitive psychology is, let's take the empirical rigor of behaviorism and a lot of what we've learned since then, from those logical positivists, for example. So let's have that experimental rigor, but let's apply it not just to behavior, but also to thought and also to mental phenomenon. So by cognitive psychology, we're back to doing studies on consciousness, memory, attention, perception. And this is kind of the in-between. Okay, so let's fire at this and just talk about some of these characters and their role. And I do realize we got a whole lot of blue going on here today. I hope it's calming. It's calming, relaxing. Okay, let's go into the first character, Hilgard, Ernest Hilgard. You've heard sort of this story a few times during this history course, and it is an interesting story that, sometimes people have a major or leave a major mark on psychology as textbook writers. So literally, imagine you were a student in some area, you've learned a bunch of things, you've taught some things, and at some point, maybe somebody approaches you, maybe a publisher approaches you about writing a book, or maybe you just decide to do it. But when you endeavor to do that, you are now saying, okay, here's this field, and I am going to try to organize it, organize all the research that's going on, choose which research to even talk about and which research not to talk about, and then present it in a structured way that shows the connections between all that and tells a sort of story. In this case, a story about learning. Actually, Hilgard wrote a number of textbooks. So he wrote a general introduction to psychology textbook, which did very, very well. And in fact was used when I was a student. I remember seeing Hilgard's textbook floating around. He also wrote this Theories of Learning textbook, which is really going to be the core of what we're going to focus on here. So, if we think about the theories of learning, he looked at everybody who had sort of talked about learning in some way and done experiments or just talked about it and tried to bring it together. And if you do that well, a couple of powerful things happen. First of all, the people that are currently in the field see how their work is connected with others. And so you literally have an effect on the field by kind of explicitly showing connections and interactions in a way. But also, every new student who comes through and reads your textbook, that is how they think about the field, right? You are introducing it to them. And if you have a textbook that a lot of students use, your way of thinking about things is now being essentially downloaded to the future students of the field and can have a very powerful effect. So Ernest Hilgard was one of these kinds of figures. And the textbook actually goes through, the history of psych textbook we're using goes through some of the incarnations of his theories of learning textbook as they changed over time. You see the first version out in 48, but then continuing right till 1981. And so with each edition, he would revisit the edition, and things like this were happening, where Wheeler's organismic theory, field theories, some of this sort of Gestalt stuff that was in the first one disappeared from the second one. But then Freud and mathematical models appeared in the second one. They weren't in the first one. And so obviously at some point, Hilgard started to think, well, we need to be talking about Freud as well. He did kind of talk about learning and adapting a little bit. And he does have theories of learning. And therefore he should be here as well. And so as you continue, a really kind of amazing one is Pavlov wasn't even considered in a lot of the early ones. Pavlov didn't make it till the third edition. And then we get some other things, informational processing theory. We get some learning and instructional technology. How do you actually use technology to enhance learning? Something that I'm very is important in my world. I'm very much interested in. And so it's just kind of a nice survey of those things that are considered so core. And these are largely a lot of the people we're going to be talking about, mostly in this chapter. Some of them we've already talked about in other places like Skinner and Gestalt psychology and functionalism. But some of these, we've talked about Thorndike, so Guthrie, Hull, Tolman. We'll talk about these and how they link in. And these are what Hilgard saw as real core learning theorists. And through his textbook, they became very core theorists that everybody learned about and everybody got to know about. And so just that little side story of the power of an author, and a textbook author specifically, to really shape a field of science. Hilgard was one of those. Okay, so let's talk about some of these things. So Guthrie's kind of interesting. We're going to have a real contrast here between Guthrie and Hull. Guthrie being very informal, very kind of loose, and yet throwing out ideas that have really challenged some core views of learning. And then Hull being ultra formal, very mathematical, very precise in his approach to things. And so we're going to see loose versus tight science here, so to speak. Let's start with loose. Guthrie. Guthrie was known as being very folksy, a very good communicator, a very good teacher, the kind of person who could express scientific ideas in ways that everybody could understand. And so that made him sort of very powerful as a communicator of science. He considered himself a simple man. And in fact, sometimes some of the better educators will openly admit that they have trouble with complexity. And it's their own struggles with complexity and ambiguity that forces them to try to simplify things in a way they can understand. And that can often make them a powerful teacher because they can express things in these simplified ways. Whereas somebody who understands all the complexity tries to express that complexity to someone who's not ready for it, and they can't follow. So Guthrie was very good at getting from the complexity to simple kinds of things that people could follow. All right. So he, like many others, these associationists we talked about, really thought a core thing for learning was contiguity, or kind of going together. So a combination of stimuli that has accompanied a movement will, on its reoccurrence, tend to be followed by that movement. So he starts to say that if there's a chain of things that, let's say, I don't know, the clock goes to 10 and your colleague in the cubicle 3 over grabs their jacket and comes up and walks towards your cubicle, and at that point you grab your jacket and get up and walk with them to the elevator outside to have a smoke, let's say. Okay, so now we have a movement, you getting up and going outside, that follows a certain set of stimuli, right? The clock hitting a certain time and your colleague getting up and coming towards you. So if very regularly those events have been associated with you joining your colleague and going out, then that will become something you learn. That will become a pattern that you learn, and the stimuli, just by them sort of occurring again, are enough to kind of promote the movement. Okay, so these things all become linked. And he thought it was sort of as simple as that. So what I just described to you was sort of a habit, right? A habit of having a cigarette. And this is kind of the way Guthrie viewed some of these things. But he had all these clever kind of ideas and ways of studying them. So for repetition, for example, in the days of Pavlov and others, the idea is when you're conditioning a response, you repeat it. And maybe the first time that, let's talk about the link between a CS, the bell, and a UCR, drooling. Sorry, CR, drooling, CS, bell, CR, drooling. These are has to be conditioned, right? We might say early on when an animal's only had a few conditioning trials, the strength of that relationship isn't very strong. But if we repeat, we're making the connection between CS and CR stronger and stronger and stronger. Guthrie said, I don't know about that. This idea of a connection that starts out weak between two things and gets stronger and stronger and stronger. Maybe it's that over time, a given response starts to be associated with more stimuli. So let's just give you the experiment they talk about in the textbook, and it's a really kind of clever experiment. I may get it a little wrong, but I'll get the idea right. He did things like the following. He gave people a list of items to try to remember. Let's say 12 items. And he would say, okay, look at these lists, look at these 12 items, and now turn it over. Tell me how many you can remember. And let's say the person got 6 right, okay? He now had 2 groups. So for one group, they would then see the same 12 items and they would try to remember them. They'd turn them over, and we would keep doing this until they could get all 12 right. Okay. So what do you think might be happening there? Well, you could almost say in your head, well, what was going on was, okay, 6 of those items got strongly remembered. The other 6, maybe we must have been strengthening them a little bit, but not enough to remember them. And so if they're repeated over and over again, we should eventually be able to remember them. And maybe that's what's going on because they're getting stronger and stronger. But here's the clincher. He contrasted it with the following condition. Here's 12 items. Let's say people can remember 6. We say, okay, on the next time, the 6 items they remembered we repeat, but we add 6 new ones. And we say, okay, remember these 12. So let's say they get to 9. And now we give them those 9 with 3 new ones. So now we're replacing the ones they didn't remember with new ones that couldn't have been strengthened by past experience because you didn't see them. What he found is it didn't matter which way you did that. People could remember all 12 just as quickly, regardless of the method. So regardless of whether you just use the same ones they missed or whether you replace the ones they missed. And so what that implied is those ones that were missed were not being strengthened by it didn't just take more repetition to make them strong enough to be remembered. He thought each learning opportunity was an opportunity to connect some stimulus with a response. If it got connected, you had it. If it didn't, you didn't. And so it wasn't that you had a weak connection that you made stronger and stronger and stronger. Anyway, this just as an example with a nice little experiment to kind of show how he could say, well, you guys talk about it this way and you've talked about it this way for a long, but it could be this way. It's a very different way. And everyone was like, I guess it could be that way. Wow, that's kind of interesting. So that kind of thing. And similarly with reward, what Guthrie thought is that to the extent rewards have mojo, it's just because they are the end of something, that they tend to terminate some relationship between stimuli and responses. And by having that end where you're rewarded or whatever, that tends to connect the thing that happened just before that very strongly with the things before it. And so he didn't think it was the reward so much that produced the learning, other than just sort of being a punctuation point where something stopped and that facilitated the learning. Again, another just example of his ability to just kind of look at things. We often get, I should say this, sort of seduced into thinking about things the way they were explained to us. So if Skinner or Pavlov said, this is the way I think things are working, and here's some data that fits with that, we'd be, okay, that's cool. And sometimes we're not very good at saying, okay, but is there a different way of thinking about this than your way? And that's what Guthrie was good at. He was good at saying there's a different way of thinking about some of your results that suggest different things about learning and the learning process. So kind of cool and sort of powerful that way. And that's why he has this continued presence because his ideas were so simple yet clever as alternatives to the accepted views. Okay, that's a nice punch. All right, so now we have this guy that just kind of chatted and challenged views, and we're going to contrast him with Clark Hull. Clark Hull, a very precise kind of guy. So once again, we're going to see, Newton and Pythagoras kind of rear their heads. They're always in the background for some people. So first of all, let's start here. Clark Hull thought that conditioning can only be the mechanism responsible for the process of learning. In addition, a learning theory needed to provide an understanding of the organism's motives if it was to be credible. So motives and motivation are going to be critical. Like, why does this animal press a bar? Why do they care to learn? What is their motivation for learning? So the process of conditioning explained how learning occurred, while the process of motivation explained why learning occurred when it did. Now, let me remind you, by the way, in a lot of the sort of rat psychology, they would talk about motivation, but very sporadically. They would just say things like, oh, if the animal did what we want, they got a reward. That was a food pellet. How did we motivate them? Well, we kept them hungry, quite literally. We would feed them enough food to keep about 80% of their preferred body weight. So, given the chance, they would eat more food than they're currently getting. And that keeps them hungry, so that if we now put them in an experimental situation, they will work for food, so to speak. That's about as far as motivation was ever considered in the sort of standard learning context. But Hull thought it was critical to learning, was, really understand what pushes people to learn in the first place. And so he was really about motivation and bringing that into the learning theory to try to understand learning more generally, not just how it works, but why it works, what's going on. So he got very abstract, very mathematical. This is the Pythagoras-Newton thing. He tried to express everything as a formula. So for example, we are getting now back to repetition. So whatever I just said about Guthrie, Hull is going to be a more traditional view of learning. But he did things like this. He said, if I want to know how strong the link is between a stimulus and response, right? So remember, Guthrie said it doesn't really make sense to talk about weak and getting stronger, but that's what Hull is assuming here. He said with every new instance, with every new reinforcement, he came up with a way of computing 1 minus 11 raised to minus an, where n is the number of reinforcements, a is a constant that he just came up with, and that bounds this number to be between -1 and between 0 and 1 rather. That a makes sure it's between 0 and 1. So with 0 repetitions, it's at 0, but then with every repetition, the habit strength becomes stronger and stronger. So he found a way to represent that as a number between 0 and 1, to literally say how strong, for example, is, ringing a bell with respect to producing drool. So this tells you a little bit about his mindset. First of all, everything, it wasn't enough for him to just say, oh, there's a connection being formed. He wanted to mathematically define that. And he did. And in fact, he ultimately came up with a much larger equation. So here's that little bit we just talked about. But he was, first of all, let me just go a little slow here, intervening variables. So this is what, I'm sure made behaviorists before him go, oh, intervening variables. I thought we got rid of intervening variables. Intervening variables are the variables between a stimulus and a response. So remember, behaviorists, that's all they wanted to talk about was stimuli or response. But now we're getting a real interest in what happens between those two. What are the intervening important variables that will contribute to the behavior that we see? And so he came up with this complex thing. One thing I'll just show you is it's got a bunch of multiplications here, and then we're subtracting some things on the edge. You already know what habit strength is, but just to give you a sense of how he thought about things, he thought, okay, if we want to know how likely an animal is to produce a given response in a given stimulus situation, we have the habit strength that already existed, right, from learning. But there are other variables we have to think about with respect to things. So there are some variables that will also strengthen this response, but there are other variables that will weaken the response. And so he starts to talk about things that are sort of excitatory and things that are sort of inhibitory, and how these things all combine to produce the sort of energy that that stimulus has that to produce that response. So again, getting very mathematical. The textbook continue. If you want to know what some of these things are, the textbook will give you the details. For the current purposes, what I'm just suggesting is he's really doing two things here, but he's doing them in a kind of clever way. He's getting into these things behaviorists didn't want to talk about, these sort of mental states, but he's doing it in a very rigorous, precise way. So, what he has taken from behaviorism is that we can't just have these fluffy little concepts that we rely on. If we're going to talk about some intervening variables, we have to get very specific about what those variables are and what role they play, and so that we can ultimately try to predict behavior, which is the ultimate goal, using that theory to predict behavior. All right. So we're getting a bit of a theme here, right? Which is this notion of what's really going on in a learning situation. And Guthrie had his ideas. Hull is his ideas with a very mathematical thing. And Tolman as well was challenging some of these sort of established ideas in learning theory, and again pushing people towards we have to have a better understanding of what's going on in the mind. So let's do this one to give you a good example, because it's a great example of the influence that Tolman had. He started with a bunch of rats and he trained them on this apparatus. So they would walk through here and go around here and come in here, and right around here they would get a reward. Okay, so that's cool. And so if you put the rat back in A, he would quickly learn to go and go eat his reward. And so they learn this and they get really good at this. Okay, cool. So we have a bunch of rats who have learned the maze. Then we do the following to them. We put them in this maze. Now what they want to do from their learning is go, but hang on, this has been blocked, right? That would have been right around here at the end of C. That pathway has been blocked. So what do they do? So here's what Tolman said. If you believe the learning people of the past, then the stimulus, sort of walking in and seeing this entrance, has been linked, to a response of traveling down that to get your reward. Now, you can't do that anymore. So what do? Well, you would think by learning theory that you would pick a stimulus that's as close as possible to the one that gave you success before, like maybe this one, number 10, or maybe this one, number 9. Next, you might expect 11 or 8, but you should expect them to be about as equally likely. It's just how close are they to the stimulus that the animal had learned. The more similar the stimulus is, the more they should follow it. That's not what they found. What they found was, I'm gonna say 7 here. I'm not sure. I think it was 7. The route 7 or 6 was the most popular by far. Rats who couldn't go down there would go down this way. Now, why are they going down this way? And why 7 and not 12, for example? If they're going to pick one, like why did they pick this one and not this one? And in fact, it turns out they go down 7 more than they go down some of these combined. So 7 is far and away their first choice. What Tolman is saying is they didn't just learn this link of the stimulus and response, but they also gained a mental map. They kind of learned this. And they learned that, hey, if I can't go that way, but I have other options available, the most straight way to go is this way, right? The reward's sitting over there. And they have this mental map. The reward's over there, my mental map. This has been blocked. I want to get over there, and this has been blocked. How do I get over there if this has been blocked? I go this way, which is 7 or 6. 7, I guess. And so, what he's saying is, it's not enough to talk about the stimulus and response. We want to think about what the animal is actually learning. And he claimed they were learning cognitive maps. They were forming these sort of spatial representations of the world. So it's not just a response being associated with a stimulus. It's a much more complex internal learning process that's going on. Okay. I was a little disappointed, so I'm going to sneak back here. If we kind of stop at Tolman here now, which is, I think, a good place to stop, because you're getting the vibe here. So the vibe is people saying there's got to be more to understand than just SR. And let's get into the box a little bit. What I was a little disappointed with Tolman is you read that experiment with Tolman and it sounds very convincing. And then the textbook kind of says, yeah, this was never really resolved, whether rats learned the stimuli things or whether they form cognitive maps. Sounded like it was resolved to me. It sounded like Tolman's experiment was very definitive. But it does, the textbook does talk about how some of these issues kind of get batted around a little bit. People provide data and experiments that support one side, data and experiments that support the other side, and then sometimes researchers just seem to lose interest. And so they stop doing research on some issue, and it remains sort of left unresolved. Sometimes another researcher down the road picks it up and presents it in some different way and continues the research. That's that Ixion's wheel we talked about right from the beginning, right? Where a certain issue comes back. So I just want you to kind of aware and making that connection too as you hear those stories in the textbook about things not being resolved. Okay, so that's the first part of this chapter, chapter 11. I am going to have 3 videos, I think total, a short video on verbal learning, which will be next. And then a longer video where I kind of go through some of the things at the end, which will take us, all the way through Hebb and Sperry and all the way to Bandura, actually, and social learning theory. So that's the trek we're on. It all held together because these are all people who are trying to understand learning at a deeper level. And this is all bringing us towards cognitive psychology, which we will hit in the relatively near future. Okay, stopping there. Later, guys. Bye-bye.